And the U.S. House and Senate has taken steps towards expediting international trade negotiations. House Ways and Means Committee Chairman Dave Camp and Senate Finance Committee Chairman Max Baucus and Ranking Member Orrin Hatch introduced the bipartisan Congressional Trade Priority Act yesterday. Congress members released a statement saying the bill establishes 21st century congressional negotiation objectives and rules for the administration to follow when engaged in trade talks. The bill, if passed into law, would apply to the 12-nation Trans-Pacific Partnership, which includes the U.S. and the 11 other highlighted nations along the Pacific Rim. Critics of the trade deal have expressed concerns with transparency surrounding the negotiations and proposed corporate policies. The bill includes a fast-track provision which would limit congressional input on the TPP, calling for a straight up or down vote with no room for amendments and limited floor debate. To discuss the trade deal and the process of fast-tracking more, I'm joined by Lori Wallach, Director at Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. Lori, thanks for joining.
My pleasure.
So here's the bill that was introduced yesterday. It's pretty expansive. It's 107 pages, and Section 2 is the first 35 pages. You can see it's a long section. It's titled
Negotiating Objectives.
Trade Negotiation Objectives, and it clearly outlines what their objectives are, such as strengthening the system of international trade to foster economic growth and to ensure that trade agreements afford small businesses equal access to international markets. All great objectives, but that's just it. They're just objectives. They're not directives. So if this bill was passed in its entirety, how can we be assured that these objectives will be fulfilled?
Well, first of all, a bunch of the objectives are things that aren't so great. Extensions of medicine patents that would increase prices, special foreign investor rules that promote job offshoring from the U.S. and allow our laws to be attacked in international tribunals with the requirement that we pay compensation out of the Treasury. There are rules there that would limit imported food safety. So a bunch of those objectives aren't so great. But it doesn't kind of matter because none of them are binding. The way fast track the process is set up, whether or not any of the objectives are met, when Congress were to vote for this, the executive branch, the president, could sign a trade agreement before Congress votes, write implementing legislation, rewriting wide swaths of U.S. law, and send it to Congress with no committee markups. This is the one piece of legislation the president, not Congress, writes, and get a guaranteed yes or no vote in 90 days, no amendments. So it's like a legislative luge run, and they pack all kinds of extra stuff on the slide. So these trade agreements aren't about trade, but are rewriting wide swaths of domestic law, just get rammed through Congress, which is why it's so controversial.
Yeah, it's a very interesting way to circumvent the congressional process. But what chance, this bill that was introduced yesterday, does this have of becoming law, given that both the House and Senate already have bills introduced and they're bipartisan?
So what's interesting is bipartisan in name, but actually they couldn't find a single House Democrat to sponsor it. So the bill in the House doesn't have a Democratic sponsor. It's just a Republican camp, the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee.
Republicans have the majority in the House, though.
Right, but already there are 30 Republicans who, before the bill went in, said they wouldn't do fast track. They don't think it's constitutional. It delegates away Congress's exclusive constitutional authority over trade, and also a bunch of them just wouldn't think of giving more power to President Obama, if anything. Then you've got Democrats, 160 of them, before the bill even went in, said no more of that. Since then, you've had a bunch of the senior members saying, we're not for that. That's the old fast track. We need a new way to do trade. So right now, the way I think to sort of describe it is they're running out of time. It's a second year in an election year, and they don't have the votes in the House. The Senate's not going to go first. This is a bill that has to start. It's a revenue bill, so it has to start in the House.
So if it does manage to get through House and Senate, has the president expressed interest in it? Is this something he would sign off on?
Well, the president wants it. It's a huge power grab for him in the sense that he's suddenly getting rid of Congress meddling in all this law writing. I mean, he's the one who's asked for it. What's interesting, though, more, I think, is there's so rarely days when Democrats and Republicans agree on anything. The fact that House Democrats and Republicans are saying, we are going to keep our constitutional authority, it's both a reflection of how the American public generally, as Democrats, Independents, and Republicans, have gotten really upset about these trade agreements. So those members are thinking about the political liability of giving away their authority.
But this is nothing new. Fast tracking was first passed in 1974. The most recent provision expired in 2007, and it wasn't quite as controversial back in the 70s. But critics say that's because trade deals have expanded in scope and size since the 70s. So how is the TPP different from previous trade negotiations that weren't quite as controversial as this one?
Well, first of all, there have been hundreds of trade agreements since the 70s, but only 16 ever in the history of the country have had fast track. Fast track has not been in effect, but for 5 of the last 19 years. So Democratic presidents, Republican presidents have not been able to get it. Clinton lost it in a slapdown in '98 on the House floor when 171 Democrats and 71 Republicans said no. Only George W. Bush has had it, and only for 5 years, literally in the last 19 years. What is different with TPP and why now the disinclination generally not to do fast track has sort of been bulked up is TPP is the most expansive, sort of invasive agreement as far as dodging into Congress's territory. So if trade agreements are really about trade, tariffs, quotas,
right,
Congress is less nervous about giving away some of its authority. And that's what it was like in the 70s when fast track first got hatched.
And now we're talking about medicine and so
intellectual
many different
copyrights, patents, procurement, immigration law, energy policy, financial services, land use, professional licenses, food safety. It's like the entire federal statute book gets rewritten through trade agreements.
Thank you so much. This is Lori Wallach. She is the director at Public Citizens Global Trade Watch.